Good morning, and welcome to this morning's discussion of Seinfeld's episode, The Slicer. So, for the third-year clerks, this being your first Friday and therefore first Psyfeld discussion, there really is nothing to do from your end in terms of having needed to prepare. What we're going to do is just have you direct where the conversation will go. I'd like you just to identify a character or a scene that you've found interesting. And from there, allow me to work from what we have to get to some teaching objectives that I have right in front of me. So without further ado, does anybody want to unmute and just pick a character or a scene that they thought was interesting where we can begin our discussion?
Can we talk about how when Kruger threw George's clothes in the ocean?
So give me a little bit more detail about George. What did you say?
Well, George found a photo in his boss's office that he was like in the background in because of like 10 years back, he was at the beach and the boss ended up throwing his clothes into the ocean because he thought he was funny looking.
What was George's reaction? Take us through it, anyone.
To seeing himself in the photo.
No, actually, how about the incident itself?
He was really angry. He kind of threw a fit, like a temper tantrum.
I'm tempted to ask why. How about if I just kind of rephrase and say, tell me more? Because at this point, when we see the reaction, there's nothing abnormal here. But I want to get to George's thought process, or more specific, his thought content.
Maybe he thought they were targeting him on purpose, like he was being picked on.
Yeah, and as far as that day goes, not what we see during the episode, The Slicer, but as far as that day goes, how does that day end? And what does George determine has happened?
Are you talking about the original day where the photo comes from? You mean where he yells at the kids and loses it on them?
Yeah. And what's the twist for that day?
You mean that they had absolutely nothing to do with it?
Exactly right. Right. So
yeah.
When we see George throw that tantrum, and then we understand the information that's provided to George at that time, if this is recurrent behavior that impairs George and or George's functioning, then this might come to clinical attention. Right now,
so you're thinking.
Go ahead.
Oh, apologies, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, please. Mm-hmm.
So are you thinking an intermittent explosive disorder?
That would definitely be in the differential diagnosis. So intermittent explosive disorder was formerly part of a chapter so titled The Impulse Control Disorders. A little bit of a longer title in this next revision, our most recent revision of the DSM, where individuals have these explosive episodes that are in excess to what would be deemed reasonable. And he does that. Now, that's part of a differential. But I think what prompts this is that George has an external locus of control. He's got poor self-esteem. And I want to shy away from using the word paranoia. Let's say that he's hypervigilant, in that if this happened, it must have been because others had it in for him.
Yeah, that's kind of his MO throughout the series.
That's fair. We've seen George, we've lived with George for at least 9 seasons, and that's him. The initial thought in George Costanza's mind was not simply that the tide must have taken them out. It's this family must have done something wrong to me. And that prompts the behavior. So now, again, we get a second twist later on. But as far as that particular day goes, the psychiatrist or psychologist, I believe with the information they have, will or should begin to investigate George's thought process. I said it again, thought content, excuse me. And this filter within which he always processes things through a negative light, right? And feels victimized, right? Now, of course, the other teaching point here is that you've got to be very careful not to pathologize behavior. You're going to hear me say on more than one occasion, then when a patient presents with a chief complaint of blank, I would like you to force yourself to always start from the point that the behavior is normal. Even if it looks incredibly compelling that it in fact is not normal or abnormal, train your brain to always have unconditional positive regard that whatever the patient is presenting with is normal. And then the next step is ... until there is evidence to the contrary. And even if that evidence presents within seconds of the individual's presentation, it doesn't matter. That's the way I would like you to go forward and train yourself in a way to think so as to ensure unconditional positive regard. Right? And we see that here as well. Ultimately, George is right. And here we are looking at the information that's initially presented to us, but we've got to be flexible and understand that we may be wrong and there may be more information down the road. Hospital Bay number 2, a year later, and this goes for any branch of medicine, we must always be flexible and able to incorporate new information in our differential diagnosis. For George, any other observations?
I thought it was possible that he had some sort of like insecure attachment when he was younger, circling back to the low self-esteem and like ideas that maybe these people were making fun of him. And I thought that that could have stemmed from some sort of childhood trauma.
Yeah, and if you watched any of the previous seasons, again, here we're in season 9, we're in the final season. So any of the previous 8 seasons, there are several flashbacks to George or George's early childhood experiences. So we could get an idea where Larry David roots these very adult behaviors, and that's with his interaction with his parents and the maldevelopment of self-esteem and self-efficacy. It's definitely there. Which because of that, I've always wondered why Larry David has never thought to create a spinoff of a young George, because boy, would that be an incredible show. At least from a psychiatric perspective. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I haven't seen the previous seasons. Could you clarify like what type of attachment you think he had?
Well, Estelle and Frank.
I feel like insecure.
Yeah, it starts with insecurity. It definitely starts with insecurity. Mr. and Mrs. Costanza are not nurturing. They are emotionally distant. And there are several references made to George as a child where he's acted out, he's had tantrums, and just the portrayal of maladaptive parenting traits at a very young age. And that continues to be a significant source of stress for an adult George. When the Costanzas are in a particular episode, it is not without stress, and it is not without clinically significant distress for this main character. And then, of course, through the 9 seasons, there are specific episodes where there are specific examples of this. We have difficulty with audio, I apologize. Might be the Wi-Fi here that I'm connected to.
Do you think so? spoiling the end though. Like, do you think it's hard to like diagnose a pathology when like in the end it turns out you're right? So I
100%
don't
right.
know.
Yeah.
I
And
mean, Kruger turns out to actually be a terrible person. George is also a terrible person, but like,
yeah, and I think that's a major teaching point here, and that's a clinical pearl, is that we have to go into these clinical situations guarded as clinicians not to pathologize behavior, and only render a diagnosis when you feel comfortable enough that the identified behavior is not only abnormal, but causes clinically significant distress or impairment. So you've got to keep an open mind. And this is a great, I think this is a great episode to reinforce that notion that we never have all the information we do to be 100% confident in making a diagnosis upon initially meeting a person. Now, again, it may be a self-referral. They may present with a chief complaint or concern. But again, I would like every clerk that is rotating through psychiatry this rotation to convince themselves that the behavior is always normal until there's enough information to the contrary. Any other characters you'd like to discuss this morning? Any other scenes that caught your eye?
I like Jerry literally going in to yell at the dermatologist because he feels like he has his own insecurities about his own profession. And he's just like, oh, well, I feel like I'm not as good a person as this dermatologist. So he goes to like go talk smack to the dermatologist, like to basically say, you're not actually helping anyone. And the thing he goes and interrupts is a cancer screening for a potentially very like dangerous and deadly cancer in terms of melanoma, as opposed to something like basal cell. So it's just like very interesting how that's juxtaposed, on top of the fact that he's also going in because he's paranoid, because he thinks that this person somehow gave him an allergic reaction.
Let's break this down a little bit, because that's exactly what happens. Your first observation is completely accurate here. He interrupts a cancer screening because of a conversation or a feeling that also results in a conversation he has with Elaine, that she makes me feel that if I don't save lives, I am worthless. So here's Jerry now juxtaposed with his best friend, George, with a similar issue, feelings of worthlessness. Of course, perhaps also stemming from early childhood experiences. So that is definitely similar to George, guiding Jerry's adult behavior as well. And he doesn't consider that this physician may actually be or have a role where she is absolutely core to the wellness of her patients, despite her quote unquote being a dermatologist. It's Jerry's mode of thinking. The other thing I wanted to bring up too, I thought was interesting. When or how in the world would benzene ever come up on a psychiatry shelf exam?
I
This is
saw a
supposed to be-
question involving it actually, or involving something similar actually,
Go
in the
for it.
case of Munchausen's, or now it's factitious disorder.
Mhm.
But there was a practice question on UWorld involving something similar.
Yeah, interesting. So factitious disorder. What is it?
You want to, does anybody else want to go? Because I feel like I'm talking a lot, but if not, I'm happy to answer it.
Isn't it? Wait, Munchausen is like when the caregiver like harms the patient, right? Or like the child.
Well, that's imposed on another, formerly known as by proxy. But Munchausen's disease, Munchausen's disorder, and factitious disorder are, for all intents and purposes in clinical practice, interchangeable clinical terms, diagnoses. Factitious disorder is when an individual misrepresents themselves or provides misinformation, motivated by subconscious or unconscious processes. And that differentiates the other syndrome in which an individual may present with misinformation, but their motivation is different. Their motivation is a conscious effort to deceive because of external reward. That's called malingering, which is not considered to be a psych diagnosis as of 2013. And benzene can be one of those vehicles. Benzene can be one of those toxins, in this case, a solvent, in which individuals may expose themselves to so as to create a rash, for example, similar to Jerry. Not saying that Jerry Seinfeld in this episode is demonstrating that particular behavior, but that's how benzene might come up on a psychiatry shelf exam. And the other ways in which benzene might appear on a psych shelf.
It can cause delirium if you inhale enough of it. There was a gas outbreak by my middle school when I was a kid, and someone like got excited delirium because they ended up inhaling a bunch of it. But like, there was basically a giant pipe burst in the playground at my middle school, and this happened to some kid.
Yep. A delirium is a condition, a diagnosis published in the DSM that follows the 3 C's. So there are 3 major criteria to define delirium, each of which begins with the letter C. Number 1, cognition. Individuals will present with cognitive deficits. They need at least 2 from your routine mental status exam, one of which must be a disturbance or impairment in concentration and attention. The second C is the course. The acute onset and fluctuating course helps distinguish this condition from other conditions, such as major neurocognitive disorder, formerly known as dementia. And finally, that third C is the cause. The cause is always organic. In psychiatry, organic means either due to the direct and physiologic effect of a substance or an underlying medical condition. So delirium is nothing more than a behavioral disturbance of an organic pathology. Again, specifically a substance and or another medical condition. So that's delirium, and that can, one of those substances can be benzene, yeah. And then finally, the other way benzene does appear on psych shelf exams is through inhalant use disorder or inhalant intoxication, right? So the gases, the vapors are actually inhaled for their euphoric effect. There are 4 subclasses of inhalants, one of which is the solvents. And one example of a solvent would be benzene, which is why individuals who inhale the benzene vapor, who huff benzene, may have that perioral rash, depending on how they huff, similar to what Jerry presents with. And again, I'm not saying Jerry's huffing, but loose association, that is how another way in which benzene may appear in a psych shelf. Any other observations with Jerry?
I felt like Jerry might also have thought that the dermatologist had like narcissistic personality disorder, which is also why he felt keen to kind of like take her down a peg by saying like, how do you save lives? And then he got taken down a peg in the end. However, I also saw that there was like an interaction where Kramer kind of supported the high social standing and morals of the dermatologist by telling Jerry that he needed to impress this doctor and like get her flowers and give her lots of attention. So I think that that also aided in Jerry's like mental picture of thinking that he was beneath her in some sort of way, and then that supported his behavior in the end.
And now I want to discuss why, or even in part how. If Jerry is the one who comes in with a little bit of a grandiose sense of self here, and is looking to take the I almost said psychiatrist, Freudian slip, the dermatologist down a peg, letting other people know, even Dr. Siderides know, that you think you're better than me, to paraphrase. The defense mechanism here is probably projection, right? So it's the feelings one has about oneself is portrayed or is in this case projected onto another, right? So through projection, Jerry is able to come to terms with the anxiety that's created by his own feelings of self-worth. in this case, these feelings of grandiosity, which ironically, and we're not going to get into this because it's a little bit too much in depth, but his feelings of grandiosity are actually rooted in low self-esteem of all things. And that is the history of the narcissist. But again, I don't know if I'd go quite that far to say that Jerry here is diagnosed with a narcissistic personality disorder per se, but there are definite elements of narcissism here and projection.
Do you think he trips histrionic,
Which character? Jerry?
Jerry? I've had this debate with my thesis advisor for years about whether he's more histrionic or narcissistic.
I'm not sure is the right answer. And I think the real teaching point here is that the cluster B personality disorders, there are 4, 2 of which happen to be histrionic and narcissistic cluster, meaning that they do share common signs and symptoms and behaviors. So I'm going to guess your thesis advisor and yourself are both correct. On the other hand, and this is a clinical parole because this does happen and it happens quite often. I'm not so sure Jerry Seinfeld, if you actually look at the published DSM criteria, will actually reach the threshold of either diagnosis, but otherwise certainly demonstrate aspects of both. But then again, we would expect that in as much as these 2 conditions do cluster, hence why they are part of that second cluster or cluster B within the personality disorders chapter. By the way, before we leave this part of the conversation, to just make sure everybody's on the same page, the histrionic personality disorder is that condition in which the individual needs to be the center of attention. And if they are not the center of attention, they tolerate that with significant distress. Any other characters you'd like to discuss in the slicer? What's going on with Kramer?
He becomes like a little too attached to his Slicer.
I think it's fair. So let's talk about quote unquote too attached, because there's a little bit of a dynamic here that if Kramer that is were to present to clinical attention, getting a full history, performing or providing a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, we would uncover that Kramer is afflicted with gambling disorder, and that's established in the previous 8 seasons. And he has tried as a goal abstinence for his gambling disorder. A gambling disorder previously, and perhaps ironically in terms of this morning's discussion, was in a chapter prior to 2013 shared with impulse control disorder, the condition that we actually began this conversation with. But in 2013, with the revision to the DSM-5, was moved to a separate chapter, a new chapter created called the substance use disorder chapter, within which there are 2 designations or 2 subchapters, if you will, substance related and non-substance related. Gambling disorder is an example of a non-substance related addictive disorder. So Kramer's got this condition. I think it's readily diagnosable. Again, albeit in the previous 3 seasons. And what's interesting here is that he demonstrates more quote unquote addictive behaviors here, right? A little too attached, if you will. And here's a little bit of an irony. I'm going to give you some history here. The slicer obviously is part of the equation of making deli sandwiches. And the sandwich also has its roots in psychiatry, and specifically gambling disorder, the very condition Kramer himself has. The sandwich was actually invented by the Earl of Sandwich, John Montague, who probably also had gambling disorder, not getting up from the poker table for hours on end, being served meals around the clock while gambling. There were some problems with the meat getting the cards sticky. So he decided that he was going to put the meat between two slices of bread, only to keep his fingers greaseless, oil-free, and invented the sandwich as a product of his pathological gambling. So here's Kramer, who we know as pathological gambling, aka gambling disorder, as of 2013. Also, part of a subplot that focuses on, of all things, the sandwich. So the other thing Kramer, I believe, demonstrates here, at least an aspect, and we probably should tackle this maybe as our final point of this morning's discussion, is that he needs to have this slicer for the sake of having it. And when we see his apartment, when it's not being renovated by Levels or the Merv Griffin show set, it's somewhat cluttered. And this might be consistent with hoarding disorder. Now, again, I don't think we have near enough information, but it does prompt the discussion. And since this is likely to show up on a psych shelf at some point, we probably should just briefly touch on hoarding disorder, which previously was part of a larger diagnosis called obsessive compulsive disorder. With the revision of to the DSM-5, hoarding disorder was split off from OCD and given its own diagnosis. So individuals have a very difficult time parting with personal possessions, resulting in a cluttering of the living space, also resulting in clinically significant distress or impairment. So that's hoarding disorder. Individuals will part with these objects, with these items, with anxiety and distress. It's stressful for them to get rid of them. And there are designations to this, published in the DSM. There are specifiers. I don't see them coming up on a psych shelf per se, but certainly I think they would be important in clinical practice. So as a clinical pearl, whether or not the individual is hoarding too quickly or they're not getting rid of things fast enough. So two different specifiers. Is the drain clogged or is the faucet on too long? All right, a couple minutes to go here before we reach the bottom of the hour. One quick comment about Elaine. That dream sequence that she has with everyone intruding into her personal space, I found as an interesting metaphor, given that it was a dream sequence of REM intruding or REM intrusion, which is the pathophysiology of what sleep disorder? REM intrusion into non-REM states, including the beta state, that is the wakeful state, a state that everyone right now is in, if not alpha, beta. Well, REM intrusion into a non-REM state is the pathophysiology of narcolepsy. And that's why people may dream during a wakeful state and have visual hallucinations, may have a drop attack with muscle atonia, sleep paralysis. So a metaphor for narcolepsy. And there's even one scene where she just plops down exhausted. Well, might that be a metaphor for excessive daytime sleepiness? Also part of narcolepsy. Okay, again, Larry David did not script this character in this particular episode. We're discussing the slicer to have narcolepsy. But it is interesting that there is one scene where she plops down, perhaps suggestive of EDS, and another where she has this dream sequence where her friends intrude into her personal space, metaphor for REM intrusion, also narcolepsy. Any final questions or comments? All right, we'll leave it here. For those following at home, we'll be back at or around 12 o'clock to discuss today's film. Otherwise, everyone else, for those who are rounding this morning, we will meet in our suite. Thank you.